So here we are in our class of humanitarian communication. As I was telling you, today we have the seminar with Nina Hall, who is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Bologna, and she's an expert of international relations. And so we will discuss with her on advocacy in a digital area. And so we will present her talk of 25 minutes on human rights, advocacy, international relations, and power, and then we will discuss directly with Nina. So please listen to the talk.
Hello, I'm Nina Hall, and it's lovely to meet those of you who are joining from New Zealand, and I hope that you've had a really good session on power in your class with Professor McKinnon. Today I'm going to talk about power in the digital era, as I hope you can see from my slides. To give you a bit of context to this presentation, I've been working for the last few years looking at advocacy organizations and how they're using the internet to mobilize people. So I will be referring to that. To give you an example of the kinds of organizations I've been studying, here's one, 350.org. You'll probably...
Sorry, you can't see the video? How can... You are not watching the video?
Yeah, we just see the part of our class. Can you try to stop and put again your screen?
Wait, sorry. So let's see, because now if I share the screen, okay, now you have the screen, which means... Are you watching the screen now?
Yeah, now it's visible. I think it was just blocked for a second.
Is the one with Nina, stop fossil fuels, blah, blah?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let's try again. I'm sorry, but I don't understand what happened today. So now you see it, but, okay. Okay, so let's go with the video.
To meet those of you who are joining from New Zealand, and I hope that you've had a really good session on power in your class with Professor McKinnon. Today I'm going to talk about power in the digital era, as I hope you can see from my slides. To give you a bit of context to this presentation, I've been working for the last few years looking at advocacy organizations and how they're using the internet to mobilize people. So I will be referring to that. To give you an example of the kinds of organizations I've been studying, here's one, 350.org. You're probably familiar with 350.org. It campaigns on climate change and has been active since around 2009, when it was started up actually by a group of students in the US with the support of a professor, Bill McKibben. Their idea was to campaign to get the US and other countries to sign up to some kind of international agreement on climate change. But what's interesting from the perspective of the internet is that they were able to use digital technologies to mobilize people around the world. So here we have an example of one of their protests on the streets. It's not just online. And these kinds of distributed actions have also taken place in New Zealand. This is an example of last year's climate march, which was partly and mostly inspired by the Fridays for Future movement, and you may be familiar with Greta Thunberg. What's remarkable, though, is that they've used internet technologies, i.e. Facebook, social media, email, to try and inform people about the problem of climate change, and then to inform people to get along and protest on one particular day. So this occurred last year, you may recall, in late September, and across the world, we had more than 6 million people mobilized on climate change. So how does this relate to my research and to more specifically the politics of power in the digital era? Well, the work that I'm currently doing, both in terms of the book, is asking the question of how is transnational advocacy changing in the digital era? And in particular, what forms of new tactics, strategies, and organizations are we seeing, given most NGOs are already operating online? So I think an important thing to remember here is there's sometimes an overly simplified divide between online activism and offline. But what I even gave you with that very first example of 350.org, which was started as a student movement, and the name 350.org really came from a reference to how many parts per million they wanted to see a limit in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide emissions. But the point being that they were operating online and offline simultaneously. And so what sorts of new power can you get through this form of activism, through new forms of internet-enabled activism? So what I want to run through today in about 20-25 minutes is to talk about different theories of power in the digital era and relate this to a broader discussion about politics. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about advocacy. Now, obviously, there's lots of different groups that are using the internet for their own purpose, whether it be terrorist groups, whether it be governments, as we're now seeing, whether it be businesses. I am going to focus more on the advocacy side of groups that in international relations literature are often referred to as NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or advocacy organizations, or civil society organizations. But I would encourage you to read, of course, beyond that. So what have I done, just to give you a bit of background to where I'm coming from? The methods in my research, and particularly the book that I'm working on currently, and the book, I should say, is called Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era, is based on qualitative research and ethnographic methods. So I spent a lot of time with this particular organization called OPEN, the Online Progressive Engagement Network, going to summits, done over 100 interviews with activists that use digital technologies in innovative ways. I've done field visits to as far apart as Poland, Canada, the US, the UK, obviously in New Zealand also, in Wellington, where Action Station is based, and I'll get to that later. And I've also done a lot of primary research and collecting data online of what these organizations do from their social media pages, from their websites, from their emails, and of course, reading the primary and secondary literature. If I was there in class, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but happy to answer any questions that might come up indirectly or share my information. So what is changing in the digital era? How is politics and, I guess for you, power changing? Well, there's 4 ways we can think about it, at least. One is that we have new digitally empowered actors. What do I mean here? New digitally empowered actors are actors like Anonymous or WikiLeaks that use the internet in ways that give them power. So they may be hacktivists, people that can hack in and undermine government or businesses, as we saw with the example of WikiLeaks. And often some of the arguments have been from people like Taylor Owens, that wrote a book around these themes, is that non-state actors are actually better and faster at harnessing the internet and gaining power than the state because they're not as bureaucratic. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider. The second line of argument is that we have a new network public sphere. Now, these arguments were particularly strong, I'd say, around 10 years ago, as you can see from these citations. And it was full of sort of techno-optimism. So the argument being that individuals can connect with our organizations through social media or email and start mass movements, that one tiny action like posting something on Facebook could spiral up and become a mass movement. These were arguments put forward by people like Clay Shirky. Paulo Gabardo, more specifically, has focused on things like the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement. These are examples. Sometimes people talk about digitally enabled social movements. And that literature, I think there has been a bit of a pushback against it or a nuancing of it subsequently, but I think it's still present in a lot of the public debates about how the internet can lead to mass forms of maybe social movements and democratization even. The third form is a form of connective action. Now, this is quite a specific argument you find in the political science literature. And here the argument goes, and this is from Lance Bennett and Alexandra Segerberg, who've argued that in the former pre-internet days, we had collective action. Collective action was costly. You had to get over, time, effort to go out to a protest. Connective action is much easier. you can have personal identity frames that are easily adapted, like a Facebook profile photo, to take part in, say, protest action. You could show your solidarity with LGBT rights by posting a rainbow flag over your Facebook profile photo. So connective action is connecting people easily without those organizations like NGOs or interest groups. And it's facilitated by the internet because it's a personalized collective action frame. It's not something that has to be appealing to a collective like a trade union. Now that argument, I would say, is a bit of a nuance to some of the arguments we saw from Hertie and Gabaldo. But again, it's getting to this point of how can people take action and what kinds of power do they have? Now, the fourth line of arguments is one that I've been really interested in, is how do actual political organizations change in the internet era? So remember, the first line of argument was much more about how we have new actors arising that are empowered by the internet that can hack. The second and third were about new forms of collective action that can happen with mass movements. This fourth argument is saying organizations are still important, whether they be NGOs, whether they be other forms of advocacy organizations or political parties, but it's how they use the internet to mobilize people. And that's where I am really interested. More recent scholarship by people like Jen Schrady have even made the strong argument that actually we have bureaucracies are critical for getting your digital communications out. And this argument that it's very easy to be spontaneous and have influence with the internet is somewhat false. So these are the kinds of debates, I think, where the academic literature going, which go much more beyond the kind of online activism as slacktivism, it's not effective, versus the offline is. I think that that debate that's happened in a lot of the public sphere has no longer that relevant in the academic. So I want to focus in on this fourth argument for a couple of moments. Now, this fourth argument says that we have new forms of advocacy organization that are adapting in the digital era and that have emerged. So I want to give you a bit of a history of how advocacy organizations, we can categorize them or think about interest groups. Now, this builds very much on David Karp's work, who's written a book called The Move On Effect, which I draw on a lot in my own book. And he talks about 3 generations of types of interest groups and advocacy organizations. And I should say he's mostly talking about the US here. The first are identity-based groups. These are groups like Rotary, which have meetings, hold elected offices, you participate in civic activities, and you pay membership on a yearly or monthly basis. They're often cross-class. And these are an older form of organization that was really around in the sort of 1860s to 1960s. The second form, which we'll look at, are groups that you might be familiar with, like Greenpeace, working on climate change, or Amnesty on human rights. They write letters, like Amnesty, they often write letters for prisoners of consciousness, sign petitions. And the idea here is that their relationship with their members is still direct, but it's often through mail. So you might get a letter from Greenpeace saying, join us for this campaign. They're often single issue, which means they focus, say, on climate change, and they're professional. So they hire and pay professional campaigners. Now, this third one is what I'm going to talk about next. And these are the new, if you like, kinds of organizations that we've seen emerge since the internet. They enable people to take action online as well as offline. They're often issue generalists, so they work across lots of issues, and they use the internet in very innovative ways to get people to sign up to events, crowdsource ideas. And so these are 3 distinctions about how we can think about how advocacy has changed, and the relationship between how they've changed and what power they have is really important, and I want to get to that next. So this is the first generation, just to recap. And these first generation, I guess, would have power in conventional forms, maybe through lobbying particular decision makers. The second form, groups like Save the Environment or Greenpeace, would also have power through forms of lobbying individuals or through mobilizing people. So we can talk about insider and outside tactics and mobilizing people outside the Brandenburg Gate saying energy for the East without atomkraft, without nuclear energy. This was an anti-nuclear protest, which was very strong in the 80s and 90s in Germany. Now, this third generation, if we come back to them, work in a different way. They do what we call distributed network organizing. Now, if we think back to that first example of 350.org, one of the things they were really innovative about was that they were able to, and same with Fridays for Future, get multiple people in multiple countries campaigning at the same time, the same day, on the same issue. So that was climate change. The global climate strike, for instance, last year, we saw all in late September on the same Friday across the world, 6 million people mobilized. It was actually 2 Fridays, but essentially almost all on that same day marching. And they do that because they can coordinate easily online. So you get over some of the costs of collective action of organizing people. It's much easier to communicate on the internet. These groups are also issue generalists, and they fund themselves and they find out what to campaign on by looking at emails, by sending out emails, and also by listening to what their members respond to them. Now, some of the examples of these, I want to get into these, but there are some examples here. Move On was one of the first, hence David Karp's book, The Move On Effect. But there are other examples that we could look at in Australia. Get Up, Change.org, you might be familiar with. Black Lives Matter has become an organization. It was originally a social movement. In New Zealand, we have Action Station, which is actually officially one of the sister organizations of Move On. Move On was created in 1998 by people who were progressive leaning, who wanted to get over the Monica Lewinsky scandal and Bill Clinton, and get people's focus much more on progressive politics again, rather than the impeachment discussions that were happening then. Action Station was created much later. It was created around 2014, when we saw groups looking to, activists looking to emulate Move On and specifically Get Up in Australia. And as you can see, it's about people-powered change. So the question is, and I ask is, where does the power come from in this organization? And their response would be through people, through mobilizing people on the streets to take action about what they care about. And specifically, not just anyone, these are national citizens most often in these organizations. What do I mean by that? In New Zealand, Action Station works to mobilize New Zealanders to put pressure on New Zealand decision makers, i.e. the Prime Minister, government ministers, to take changes, whether it be on climate policy or refugee policy. As they say, we act together to create what we cannot achieve on our own, a society, economy, and democracy that works for us, everyday people, and the planet we love. Now, there are other examples overseas in Germany, where I'm currently working part of the time. We have this group Campact, which has been very powerful and mobilized around 250,000 people against the TTIP, which was the trade and investment treaty between Europe and the US that eventually did get scuppered, mostly thanks to Trump. And as you can see, this is again in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Almost 250,000 people mobilized, partly by Campact, as well as these other organizations that they worked with, you can see in the flag. We've got organizations in Israel on the top left, Zazim, which is similar to Action Station and to Campact. Get Up down the bottom, campaigning on refugee issues, and a similar organization in India, Japka, doing a campaign against Unilever. So all of these organizations campaign in a similar way. And they were born as digital actors. And Ariadne Vroman, actually in a book, which is, no longer forthcoming, has made this point very clearly, that they have reframed their approach to all dimensions of campaigning, including membership, fundraising, and tactics, that they are profoundly different as organizations from those first generation like Rotary, or that second generation like Greenpeace, which are much more focused on direct communication with their members through letters and weren't able to listen or do what we will soon talk about, digital analytics, to actually test campaigns and figure out what their members most cared about and would most support. So as we've seen, their tactics are things like sending an email, starting an e-petition, so you can put up a petition online instead of standing on the street and gathering names. You can join local actions online or offline. You can donate money really easily, rather than standing and trying to collect money at a meeting. You can just put up a post or an email or a Twitter tweet and say, please donate to this cause. We think it's really important. You can spread video, which Facebook has prioritized for a long time, encourage people to make phone calls. And as Karp and Vroman have talked about, they really prioritize a storytelling approach. This is again an example from Campact of just a post of how they tried to build an offline action. So it was a human chain of people holding hands to campaign against violence, and they've been very strong, for instance, around refugee rights in Germany. And that's an offline action, but they've mobilized people online. So I think keep in mind that these two forms, that online can enforce offline activism. So where does this get to? So far, I've been talking about what the literature and political communications broadly has been speaking about, and trying to link it a little bit to our notions of power in international relations, although I admit there's a lot more to be said there. So what am I working on? I'm working on a book called Transnational Advocacy in the Digital Era. And one of my core arguments is that a lot of these activists are thinking global, but acting local. And what I find in this book is that these new digital advocacy organizations are challenging mainstream IR theories of advocacy. I'm going to pull out these three key things and three ways that advocacy organizations are challenging IR theories of advocacy. So first of all, they're multi-issue. These third generation, these action station campaign that I'm talking about, campaign across lots of issues, from climate change to refugee rights, to human rights, to water quality, food quality, all of the time. And most of the second generation organizations, those more traditional NGOs created before the internet, are much more single issue. So they stick to something like climate change and Greenpeace and say, this is important. We're not changing. We're not one day campaigning on climate change and the next day campaigning on something completely different, right? And this is important because they actually get a lot of their authority, these second generation NGOs like Greenpeace, through their expertise. And other scholars, which I haven't listed here, like Stroop and Wong, really focus on that. The second way these third generation advocacy organizations are different is that they're rapid response. So what I mean by that is, when I say one day they can campaign on climate change and the next day they can be campaigning on care rights, I literally mean they can set up a petition, launch it, push it to their members, and try and get members to sign up to a particular petition, or launch a campaign on Facebook or Twitter. It's fast. We all know how quickly and easy it is to say something on Facebook or in other social media forum. Now, the other older organizations have much more long-term agenda setting campaigns. They stick to an issue long-term. What does that mean? It means that when they're campaigning, they don't just start one issue one day and then abandon it, because that would undermine their causes, right? If we think of the suffragettes in New Zealand, when they stood up to say we want the right to vote, they didn't just start and then the next day, oh, this is a bit hard, we'll focus on a different issue instead. The whole point of much of the literature emphasizes that you've got to be sustained, because often there's vested interests working against you. The third way that these groups are different, these digital advocacy organizations, these third generation action station like, is that they're member driven. And they use digital analytics, which I've mentioned and Karp talks about, to test campaigns, to listen to their membership closely. So they'll send out an email saying, campaign against trade agreements, for instance, and frame it, say, around the environment, to protect the environment, or around human rights, and figure out which works best with their membership. And that's a very different way of campaigning from groups like Oxfam. If you talk with Oxfam at the beginning of the year, they'll be, what is our campaign plan for the year? And it'll be professional staff who are deciding and defining that campaign. And so why is this all important? I would argue it's important because they have different forms of power. The power in conventional or second generation NGOs that most of the scholarship in international relations is focused on up till now focuses, I said, on things like expertise, often insider lobbying, getting access to decision makers, access to international organizations and negotiations like the climate negotiations. And you do that by saying, I'm committed to this issue, I have expertise on climate change, and I'm going to show you this is what the best climate agreement would look like. In contrast, digital advocacy organizations aren't trying to do that. They're trying to mobilize people on the streets. Remember that first image of people mobilized outside Parliament, and put pressure on decision makers that way. And they're using digital tools to do that in a very savvy way. One of the final points in my book, which I won't get into as much though, is to say that although they're really fast at campaigning and though they can seize critical junctures, doesn't necessarily mean they are doing more transnational advocacy, that they're doing more at the international level. So if we think back to that example I gave of Action Station is mobilizing New Zealand citizens to take action on issues which may be domestic, child poverty, or international climate change. But regardless, they're targeting New Zealand citizens who put pressure on New Zealand government. And why is that important? That's important because in the international relations sphere, we're often interested in what happens at international summits, like the Climate Summit or the WTO, and the power plays that happen between states and NGOs and the influence those NGOs have. Now, this is a little bit more of a nuanced argument I'm making here, and I'm saying that digital advocacy organizations are important internationally, but the way they do it is through targeting domestic decision makers to change their positions on international priorities. And I'd be happy to answer any more questions about this or to send work on to Malcolm to clarify this argument, because it's the point that I'm wrestling with right now and how to express it and make it really clearly in the book that I'm writing. Why it's important to make this argument is that in the past, a lot of scholars have assumed that the internet would lead to a global civil society. So we saw scholars like Jan Schultz and others saying the internet now will mean the end of sovereign borders, and we will see this kind of collectives emerge across the world that have transnational solidarities, and it will be facilitated because communication will be so easy, and we'll know what's happening between Indigenous activists in Australia and Latin America and Africa, and they'll all be able to unite. And my book's suggesting that we need to be cautious, and that may not always be the case, and that nation states continue to be important, and that the locus of power is in those nation states, and activists are aware of that, and so where they're targeting their activism continues to be the nation state. So just to round off, I want to make a further point that I've made in a separate article about what does this mean for advocacy more generally. Because these third generation advocacy organizations have emphasized a new and nimble, they have different kinds of staffing structures, they're less bureaucratic, they try and have, members that will take actions. And I would argue that traditional NGOs, some like Greenpeace, are also taking on these strategies. They're doing both online and offline engagement. They're engaging in getting their members to give micro donations, to do crowd fundraising. They're using storytelling in really innovative ways. They're using social media and the internet. In fact, most NGOs now use the internet. And in an article I've written with two colleagues, Hans-Peter Schmitz in the US and Michael Dedman, also in the US, a PhD student at Syracuse University, we've argued that they are harnessing new forms of networked power in some cases. NGOs, both the third generation and the more older Greenpeaces and Oxfams, are starting to tap into what we call networked power by trying to facilitate movements. I think Fridays for Future is a great example of how they've facilitated a movement. And we pick out some different tactics and strategies that mainstream NGOs can use. And we don't argue that they're all facilitating mass movements online or offline using digital, but we show 4 different ways they can do so. And just to give you one other example, in the first top left box, you can see staff produce advocacy materials like a report, and then they broadcast it online. Now, that's just a traditional way of doing advocacy. Human Rights Watch writes a report about human rights abuses in Syria and wants to tell the world and inform them of this, and then just uses a different form of activism, of a different channel to do so. So that's one really key argument that we're trying to put forward to the lecture. There are multiple ways NGOs can harness power in the digital era. One of them is this new form of network power where you facilitate movements by trying to bring the public together around an issue on a particular day or a moment. But there's also, you can just use the internet in a kind of conventional way of just spreading a message. So we shouldn't think of all forms of advocacy in the same way and using the same sorts of power. To finish up, I have a few recent publications if you're interested to read more. One is a special issue in the Journal of Information Technology and Politics, which James Dennis and I have coordinated and edited together about innovation, adaptation, advocacy organizations. And there's some great pieces, including by scholars like David Karp, who I've mentioned, about how we think about time in the digital era and the digital eras he argues for, as well as a recently graduated PhD student Amber McIntyre on how amnesty is adapting to the digital era. And that came out at the beginning of this year. Then I have another piece, which I would just mention, it's a little bit older, but it looks at norm contestation. So an IR scholarship around norms in the digital era and how we can think about campaigning for refugee rights in particular. I've really enjoyed talking with you all. I'm sorry I can't be there today and hope that the session goes really well. All the best. And thanks for having me. And hope to hear from Malcolm about the questions and conversation you've had.
Okay, thanks very much to Nina Hall. I hope you can hear me now. Okay, I just admit Nina with us. Okay, can you hear me? Nina is with us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, wow, great. Perfect, Nina.
Buongiorno a tutti. Hello.
I just said that I feel like a DJ here. I have like 2 different computers. Then there was the video. Now you are online. You are alive, but online. Anyway, thanks, Nina. Thanks, Nina, for being with us. I mean, we introduced already you and your activities. So we just watched the video. And so I invite our students to, if they have questions for you, curiosities, as I told them, I mean, they have your article in the syllabus. And so if they have some question, I just do a couple of questions just to break the ice with you. So, I mean, you were discussing on strategies of engagement, I mean, I would like to focus more on what do you think are the main differences in doing advocacy, lobby, and campaigning in the digital area, where we focus on refugees and climate change, which are the 2 topics also of your talk and of our class, and especially with a different perspective between Europe, because most of us, we are focusing on European issues, and New Zealand, Australia also, because, I mean, we discussed just a little bit about some policies from Australia, and then you come from New Zealand, so maybe you can tell us something different, discussing on the 2 different perspectives.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting me, Professor Pierluigi Musarò. It's a real pleasure to talk with you all in this class, and I hope to hear your questions. And so, you know, the presentation you heard was actually for a class in New Zealand. So that was why there were some examples from New Zealand at the beginning about climate campaigns. And it's part of a book project that I'm writing, in fact, was working on this morning about how is advocacy changing in the digital era. So I'd say, first of all, that one mistake many people make is that they assume we can easily divide between the online world and the offline world. But most of you here are operating online most of the time. We carry our phones around, which we're constantly online. Maybe you have Imuni on or Google or WhatsApp. You're sitting there, maybe even shouldn't be checking your phone as we speak. So this idea of a division between the online and offline world is a bit false. And what I try and do in my research, and others have done as well, not just myself, is get a bit more nuanced about what it means. What are the different digital strategies online? And so what we can think about is at least a couple, which I think I talked about as well in the talk, of like broadcasting. So groups that campaign, for instance, for refugee rights can message and broadcast on social media about a crisis, like what just happened today in the Mediterranean with a ship overturning, or about Syria, and that's just a way to spread information. So refugee campaigns can be similar to what we saw in the past, but instead of using television or radio or newspapers, you use social media. And where I think it gets interesting is where you use digital tools to mobilize or to organize. So mobilizing is where you bring lots of people together onto the streets, like that first image I had in the PowerPoint of people mobilized around climate change. And organize means you might give them power to organize themselves. So 350.org in the climate space is very famous for giving local chapters, or Extinction Rebellion as well, having local chapters that organize their own autonomous actions. So there's not a headquarters saying, here's the message you have to spread, but it's more autonomous. And so I think with those three different, the broadcasting or mobilizing or organizing are three different ways of thinking about campaigning. And to link back to your question, Pierluigi, you asked me about, well, how do we understand the differences? I think lobbying is mostly targeted messaging to decision makers. So when you're lobbying, you normally are knocking on the door of a prime minister or a minister or an international negotiator and saying, this is what needs to be in the climate negotiation agreement, or this is what needs to be in the refugee policy of Italy. And so often you might be more about technical information and broadcasting, whereas outsider campaigning is often more about mobilizing public opinion. So it's more about the mobilizing and organizing. So that's quite a lot that I've tried to cover. I'm happy to go more in depth, but just to round off on this comparison between New Zealand and the EU, and maybe others can ask more about them. Just this week, I read a great report on digital organizing in Europe, which used these three categories and looked at how different NGOs campaign in Europe with digital strategies. And it found most European campaigns campaign broadcasting, spreading their messages on social media, rather than organizing and giving their supporters power, even though many actually NGOs want to do more organizing. And I can share that link with the professor, and if any of you are interested in reading, I think it's a really good way to try and get your head around these different types of digital strategy.
Yes, I mean, we were discussing also about Avaz and other platforms, right? Because these are kind of the new digital amnesty. I mean, I don't know if you see differences between this kind of platform where, I mean, there is a big platform, there are people participating, but there is not such a structure of movement and a democratic organization, like, for example, Amnesty International. What do you think about it?
No, this is a mistake many make. Many assume that when you're operating online, there's no organization behind it, that it's just diffuse individuals. Avaz has permanent staff. They're paid campaigners sitting in offices, just like Amnesty, deciding what campaigns to run. The organizations that I mentioned, like Move On, Campact, in my study, also have permanent staff sitting in offices. They're paid, they're professionals, right? So they're not, what a lot of the early literature around the digital era said was that we were going to see individuals self-organizing. They just spontaneously create these campaigns. But even if you look at things like Black Lives Matter, there were individuals involved in creating institutions. Black Lives Matter is a hashtag, but it has an organization behind it. And that's important because it emphasizes that political organizations are still important. They retain information, institutional memory, people develop skills. What the difference is, that I argue in my work, is that they aren't issue experts. So Amnesty has people that are human rights experts. If you see an advert for Amnesty and you want to go apply for a job there, you will expect it to know something about human rights, right? You'll be expected to be able to understand, where do human rights come from? You know, what does somebody in Syria, what human rights frameworks can they appeal to? Now, if you work at Avaz or Move On, that's not necessarily the case. These new organizations campaign across so many issues: climate change, trade, LGBT rights, refugees, that they want people with very general skills, not issue specific. So they're very good at doing things online, at creating visual videos that go viral, but their skill isn't in the issue. And I think that creates interesting challenges and problems.
Okay, I would like to ask to the students if they have some questions. Do you have? You can write in the chat or you can raise your hands.
I don't bite.
Especially online.
No.
I mean, the students, they have to analyze the campaign also. I think that they are on the process to choose a campaign. They have to analyze the way the campaign is organized, the impact. So maybe we can explore if Nina has some suggestion, advices on some specific ways that you think are particularly innovative.
Sure. Well, maybe I can talk about the Australian New Zealand campaigns, because I know you haven't had anyone talk about those yet, and that's something. Sorry?
On which topic?
On refugees.
Oh, great.
Is that useful?
Yes, yes, please.
So I think I mentioned in my the short piece that you read a couple of campaigns that are really interesting. So Get Up is a digital advocacy organization that campaigns on refugee rights, along with a number of other issues. And their head, Shen, has been very innovative in campaigning to stop or to get people off offshore detention. So in Australia, as you may or may not be aware, if you try and seek asylum by coming across the waters, arriving from Asia, from Indonesia on a boat, a bit like what we see here across the Mediterranean, the Australian Army will stop you and put you into detention. And that is, first of all, illegal. It's not according to international law, and they'll hold you there. And this is men, women, children, although increasingly people have been coming off. So in the last 10 years, Get Up has been running a lot of campaigns to try and get people out of these detention centres, which are essentially prisons. And last year we heard from Behrouz Bouchani, who was at the time an Iranian Kurd journalist in one of these detention centres, and I recommend looking at his work to understand what it looks like, because they're horrific. You know, you have no freedoms. The conditions are really appalling. So what has Get Up done? They ran one successful campaign called Let Them Stay. You can look at it on a hashtag. Let Them Stay was targeting about 33 babies, about over 100 individuals who were on the Australian mainland for medical reasons. They'd been brought from the detention centre for a short stay to get medical care. And the idea was to send them back because they'd finished their medical treatment. The campaign focused very heavily on the children and the babies and said, why are we sending them back to this dangerous camp? And the Let Them Stay campaign, which I talked about in the chapter, was very innovative because it walked across the refugee sector. Sometimes campaigns are very much driven by one organisation, but Get Up worked with the Human Rights Law Centre and got everyone across the refugee sector involved and got huge coverage for the campaign, and lots of people turned out and mobilised on the streets because they were very upset at seeing these images of babies and thinking they're going to be sent back to detention. They also blockaded a hospital in Brisbane, which, as I mentioned. And so that's one example. They used the media in a very savvy way. And I should say they had the permission of the parents to use the baby's images. And they worked very closely with grassroots refugee organisations. That's one. A second one I'll just mention briefly that Get Up did is No Business in Abuse. So they tried to target the banks that fund the detention centres indirectly by giving funding to the private company. So the idea here, and you see this a lot in campaigning, is to try and, instead of turning public opinion against it, tackling the funders and saying, how can you be funding? This is morally wrong, it's illegal, yet you're giving funding to this prison system. And so they actually came to Europe and did a bunch of meetings with banks. And the No Business in Abuse campaign is also something you can find online. So they're two interesting examples. There's a third example from New Zealand, which I'll mention is called Double the Quota. And there's a book, do I even have it here? No. Which is by Murdoch Stevens, a New Zealand refugee campaigner, which details that campaign. So if you wanted to get a lot of literature on a particular campaign, the Double the Quota in New Zealand one has a whole really accessible book by Bridget Williams Books. And it details how New Zealand went from having a very tiny refugee quota, both in absolute and relative terms, to doubling it. And it took several years to get there. And our number of refugees in New Zealand was lower per capita than in Australia. So this was really, really important work.
Yeah, Thanks, Nina. I think there are some questions I was not watching in the chat.
Oh, great.
But there is Sol Bjork.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a good presentation. It's really interesting, your research. So I was thinking, you have researched how digital campaigns can influence refugee politics in very specific moments of public attention. Mm-hmm. And you criticize how the following changes did not make a huge structural change and can also lead to clicktivism. So I was wondering whether you can see any potential in digital activism for like long-term influences like historic grassroots movements has had, and how this could happen. Is digital activism doomed to be short-term? Thanks.
Thanks for that great question. So just to clarify, I think that a lot of the debates about collectivism are oversimplified. What I mean by that is that people look at somebody changing their Facebook profile or signing a petition and say that tactic is not effective and it's not going to get long-term change. And I think there's truth in that, right? Just by, if you change your Facebook profile to put a rainbow flag to say your solidarity with LGBT, does that cause change? Maybe not. But I don't think that's the right way to approach the question, because most tactics in and of themselves, if we evaluate them, have their limitations. I think what's more important is to understand under what conditions do campaigns have long-term impact. Now, the organizations that I study that use a lot of digital tactics as well as offline tactics, right? Because GetUp, the example I just gave, goes to banks and tells them to stop funding in person. They get people on the street, right? They're not just doing stuff online. Now, what I see as one limitation is that some of these groups I study switch campaigns all the time. So earlier when I was replying to Pierluigi, I said, they're not issue experts. And I think that can be an issue. It can be an issue because one day you campaign on refugee rights because there's a lot of public interest in it, say in 2015 when the refugee crisis was happening. But then the next day something else comes up, COVID, so you campaign on that and the other issue gets forgotten. Now, not all groups do this. So this critique is a critique of a very specific set of organizations. Some groups like 350.org, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, stick to the same issue. And GetUp, the other organization I mentioned, although it fits in that bucket of being multi-issue and campaigns on lots of different issues, it actually has quite a long-term commitment to refugee issues. So it doesn't switch away from them so quickly. So that's a messy answer, but I guess the heart of it is, I think it's very important that you have groups that really understand an issue and are deeply connected with that community and sustain campaigning over time, regardless of the tactics they use. And I think that's what's really, really important. And most of the literature in international relations focuses on those sort of long-term campaigns. And there can be others that come in at critical moments to push it over an edge, but you always need a group of organizations that are there continuing to work on that issue.
Great, thanks, Nina. We have Chiara Cigliano who want to ask you something else.
Great.
Yes, good evening. I wrote the question in the chat, but I can read it out loud. I wanted to ask if you think activism in the digital era, since it's also composed by many smaller campaigns that try to convince you that you have to care about everything all at once, if this kind of activism kind of fosters compassion fatigue. It seems to me that more than asking for donations, a lot of campaigns ask for constant attention. And since it is far easier today to kind of pay attention to everything that's happening in the world at once, so the Amazon burning and Australia burning and terrorism and feminism and whatever, and especially with COVID now, it feels as if people have a duty to care about everything at once because they have the means to. And it feels like campaigns kind of count more on the attention of people than on the money. Like money is a second step today, it feels. Like I get a lot of emails asking me to read about things. Whenever I sign one campaign, then 10 more appear. And then money is kind of an afterthought unless I subscribe to something. So I wanted to ask you about this in particular.
It's a really interesting question. And in a way, you're getting to what is the political economy of these organizations that campaign online. So my answer is, yeah, I think there is attention fatigue. I think the way many organizations that campaign frequently online operate is they want to hook us in to issues and then bring us into their mailing list and into their members, because often they use metrics of success that are membership growth. So the way they report on how successful they are as organizations is say, look, we've added this many new members. This many people have clicked on our emails, and this many people have opened them, and this many people have taken actions. In fact, just this week in my class, we talked about what we call vanity metrics in evaluating advocacy and the problems surrounded with that, because you're not necessarily actually measuring substantive impact or change. So I think you're right to observe that. I would say, though, on the funding, that most of these organizations, at least the ones I study, seek to be predominantly member funded. So even if your experience is that there's competing for attention, many of them do actually also want your money. And many of them are majority funded by crowdsourcing. So my understanding is that a lot of them have figured out the optimal number of times to ask people for funding. So they won't ask you every email. They might ask you once every 6, because they recognize that if they ask all the time, it may not be effective. That could be one explanation why you're not seeing it as frequently. There may be also cases where some organizations get big grants to do some of their campaigning. And so on a particular issue, maybe climate change, they don't need as much funding. But I certainly think what's interesting is that they are cognizant and testing their emails because they need to be able to keep your attention and at some point to get your funding. At least that's kind of my take on it. Yeah.
Thank you a lot for your answer. And maybe I just wanted to ask, do you think this is effective? Like, since there are so many smaller local campaigns that maybe, of course, will have an impact on a bigger scale, but do you think it is effective to ask for attention on so many levels and so many topics? Isn't it counterproductive at some point?
Yeah, I think that you're right to be cynical. I think there can be problems with that style of campaigning. And one problem I highlight in my other research is that groups don't follow through on their campaigns. And so some of the refugee campaigning we saw, they were very active in 2015 and then dropped the issue later, so that they didn't actually check that what they claimed happened or won actually happened in terms of refugees arriving. However, I would also take a slightly different approach to that question to say we need a sort of population ecology understanding of advocacy. And what I mean by that is we need lots of different types of organizations operating in any area, whether it be refugee issues or climate issues, and what they should bring different skills. So some of these groups that shift issues have a much broader membership, and groups that are just refugee experts, they tend to have quite a small membership, so they can only appeal to people who are already convinced that refugees need assistance. And those groups sometimes find it hard to get more mainstream support. And so groups that have a broader range of issues that shift around, as you were highlighting, can sometimes bring in a broader member of the public and convince them at key moments, at key tipping point moments. And that's the argument that they make for their model. These groups that fit the open model, which I talk about in the presentation, claim to be able to bring in at critical junctures key sort of mobilize a significant segment of the population. And I think there is something in that. And I don't think all organizations should follow that model, but I think that there is a utility and there is a strength in that kind of advocacy at certain points in time.
Thanks, Nina. I think
Thank you very much.
No problem, Chiara.
We have times maybe for the last question, because I know that you have to go. And Sarmella, I think, want to ask something about a New Zealand campaign, a Kiwi campaign.
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My group and I choose a New Zealand campaign to analyze. and it's called Give Nothing to Racism. And I would like to know your thoughts about it.
Great question. I'm looking it up now. I have heard of the campaign, but I can't give you details on it. If I'm right, I think it was a campaign, the Human Rights Commission is very well known. I'm trying to see if Taika Waititi, who's a famous filmmaker, I think was involved in this campaign, if I'm not mistaken. And I guess the main thing I can say in terms of context is that New Zealand is often thought of as a very peaceful, perfect paradise. We have a Prime Minister who's very well known for being progressive. However, there is racism in New Zealand, and it is a massive issue. And that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot internationally, and that racism can be towards Māori, our Indigenous population, can be towards Pacific Islanders, who are Pacific Island New Zealanders, and immigrant Pacific Islanders, who make up a large proportion of our population, can be towards Asian New Zealanders, a large portion of New Zealanders also Asian, and as we saw with the terrible attacks in Christchurch, also towards Muslims. And there have been a lot of reports trying to interrogate what happened in Christchurch when a white supremacist killer attacker killed 51 Muslims. So I guess just it's important to understand that context of a long history of colonialism in New Zealand, what that's meant for Māori. And if you're curious to understand or read a bit more about that, there's actually a great conference right now, which I was at last night, on social movements, resistance and social change in New Zealand. That's the title of the conference. And it talks all about sort of these sorts of themes. So I can't give you any specifics, but I would really encourage you to read around and understand the context of racism in New Zealand. And Taika Waititi, look him up too.
Okay, thank you.
Nina, we have 2 more questions. Do you have like 7 minutes?
Fine.
Great. So Ruta and then Marilu, please.
Yeah, in your presentation, you said that like digital technology doesn't lead to more transnational advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
But then I was thinking if there are like also actors that take not domestic issues, but for example, I know issue that happening in like women rights in Poland, and that in other countries some famous people or even organizations try to mobilize people for something that happens not in their country. So in this case, they don't have a power, or do they? That would be my question.
Yeah. So I tried to make quite a bold claim in the presentation, which I don't substantiate. So you're right to question me on it. I'm in the book, I spend a few hundred pages on this point, and I'm still trying to get it right. So be patient with me. The argument I'm trying to make is that a lot of scholars argued when the internet arrived, we would suddenly see this flourish of global civil society, that everyone can connect across borders, and that we would see all of these campaigns and solidarity campaigns, a bit like the one you mentioned of, say, somebody in Italy being and helping somebody in Poland. Now, the argument I'm making is about a specific group of organizations, right? These digital advocacy organizations. And I'm saying they are an easy case for transnational campaigning. Why? Because they all work on international issues like climate change and refugees, and they all operating online. So we would expect them to follow what you just described, to say there's an issue in Poland or an issue in Bolivia or an issue in New Zealand, we should campaign on it. But what I find in my research, and I collected lots of their campaigns, is that they almost never campaign on an issue that is, say, in New Zealand or Poland, far away, unless it directly affects the people there. So they campaign on trade because Germany is trying to form a trade agreement, or they campaign on climate change, but with a national focus on getting rid of a mine in New Zealand or Australia. And they don't use transnational allies publicly, and they don't target international institutions or decision makers. What they do is focus on the nation state. So the key message I make in my book is that even though we have all these digital advocacy organizations and we have all this technology and all these international issues, we don't actually automatically get lots of transnational campaigns. Now, that's not to say that there aren't still campaigns out there that operate in the way you describe. I wouldn't say that there's none at all, but I'm saying that in these cases, when we would expect to see it, given what the scholarship has told us this far, we actually don't. And that's puzzling. So I hope that helps you. And I guess the key point to take away from that is that people are very rooted in their communities. And even if they care about international issues, they're what Sydney Tarot calls rooted cosmopolitans.
Thanks, Nina. I think we have just time, a few minutes for the last question by Marilu.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I wrote it in the chat, but I will just read it. I read in your article that you said that refugee campaigns took advantage of the Alan Kurdi moment. I was thinking, have you ever considered how activism could be right now, today, if that picture had never been taken? Do you believe it will be different or similar?
Yeah, it's a good counterfactual question, as we say in social science. There are others who've talked about it as the Alan Kurdi moment. So just to clarify, this is something I argue in this piece, but others have also made similar claims that this was a very particular moment for many refugee groups because people were really alarmed by that image. And I guess for me the question is, would another image have done that? Maybe there would have been other ones because there were a lot of powerful images taken around that time. And I'm sure Pierluigi can also reflect and add to this given his scholarship and work around these issues. So I think there was a real sense of concern in Europe specifically in the late summer, late August, early September of 2015 around what was happening. And that moment, the Alan Kurdi photo certainly crystallized a lot of action. But I still think there would have been, it may not have been focused around that particular image, but I think there would have been other images and other moments, maybe not as symbolic or as iconic as that one. But it's hard to know, in all honesty. I mean, yeah, your guess is as good as mine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. In Italy we say con i se, con i ma la storia non si fa, which is a way to say, yes, it's hardly to know, right? How can we do this hypothesis? But I'm very, very, very grateful, Nina, for your time and also to the students for this very useful discussion. I know that Nina has to go because she has another meeting right now. And I mean, we will keep on discussing on the topic now, but we just say ciao and thanks to Nina. I don't know if we can clap our hands in an online mode, Nina.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to join you in your class, and I hope that the rest of your discussions go well, and I look forward to hearing about them through Pierluigi. All the best and have a lovely afternoon and stay safe.
Great. Thanks very much, Nina.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.